Today's daf is Tzadi Dalid, and we'll start again a review of the Mishnah that we covered yesterday on Tzadi Gimel Amid Beis. And the Mishnah is comparing Smicha to Tnufa. And the Mishnah establishes that there's a certain Chumrah in Tnufa above and beyond Smicha, and vice versa. There's also a Chumrah in Smicha that doesn't apply to Tnufa. And the Mishnah details it in the following way. What happens in the case of partnership? Let's say you have many people bringing a common korban. So in the case of Tnufa, we have a kula that one person does the Tnufa on behalf of the entire Chabura. However, in the case of Smicha, we have a chumrah that every single person has to do the smicha. They're going to line up one behind the other. Reuven will do his smicha, then Shimon, and then Levi. But on the other hand, we have a chumrah in Tnufa that we don't find in smicha, and that is that Tnufa applies both with a live animal that's called michayim, and even after shchita. So we have situations in which we have Tnufa evenly achar misa, after the animal was shechted. And the Mishnah goes on to tell us that there's another chumrah in Tnufa, that noheges bekarbanos hayochid ubekarbanos hatzibur. So let's take, for example, the kivsei atzeres that are brought on Shavuos. They are a karban tzibur, and yet they require Tnufa. With regard to smicha, smicha only applies to a karban yachid and not to a karban tzibur. So now we learn the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan. And the Gemara quotes a brisa to prove to us through a drasha that in the case of smicha we have a chumrah that every single one of the partners individually lined up and does smicha, and that's based on the pasuk karbano. And karbano is in the possessive. He has to do his smicha. The rabbos, and this is a ribui, kol bali karbon l'smicha. All the members of the chabura, the partnership in bringing the korban, have to, each and every one of them, implement smicha. Now the question is, in the case of Tnufa, the Mishnah had established that one of the shutfim will do the actual Tnufa on behalf of all the others. And the Gemara now quotes a brisa that logically we would have said no. We would have derived from a kal vachomer that if smicha requires that every single member of the Chabura implement his own smicha, then how much more so in the case of Tnufa, which is more chamur, each member of the partnership should be required to do his own Tnufa. And the lumdus of it is that in this kal vachomer, we would say that just like in smicha there's a chovas gavra, each individual member of the chabur has to fulfill his personal obligation to do smicha. So too in tnufa, it's not enough that the korban had a tnufa and it was waived, but rather it's a chovas gavra. Sheyochav halo dinu. And what's the kal vachomer? Ma tnufa shenisrab so b'shchutim, that you have a chumrah in tnufa that you don't have in smicha, that in tnufa there's tnufa even after the shechita, even after the animal is gone. And not only that, there'll be tnufa on something that's not even a bal chai, ein bo ruach chayim. We failed to mention that earlier in the Mishnah. Namely, we'll have tnufa in lechem, for example, in the shtel lechem, or perhaps in the lachmei toda. Anyway, nismata bechovrin is then, I would say the following, Nismato b'chovrin means that if you have partnership, we said that one member of the partnership will do the tenufa on behalf of everyone else. And that kula should certainly apply to smicha, because smicha is more kal than tenufa, insofar as tenufa applies even after shchita, whereas smicha doesn't. Is therefore no din tismayit bechovrin. It should be enough that one person do the smicha on behalf of all the other members of the partnership, meaning that smicha is only a din in the carbon, the cheft of the carbon. Talmud loma carbon no. That's why we need that extra pasuk carbon no in regard to smicha, that he owning the carbon has to do smicha, and therefore kol bali carbon, every single last member of the partnership will have to implement smicha. So now the Gemara turns it around the other way. And we should now say the following, that if in the case of smicha, we have the ribui of karbono obligating each individual partner in his own personal act of smicha, then how much more so in tenufa, we should require that every member of the partnership should be doing a ma'aseh tenufa. V'tisrabe tenufa b'chovrim mikal v'chomer. Now, we just finished establishing that tenufa is more chomer than smicha, insofar as that tenufa applies even to the animal limbs after shchita, whereas smicha only applies michayim. So therefore, we should derive the conclusion that if in smicha every single one of the members of the partnership has to do his personal act of smicha, how much more so in the case of tenufa. Right, smicha only applies when the animal's alive. Yet nisrab subachovra in the Torah was machmir, and in smicha required that every single member of the partnership implement his own personal smicha. Is tenufa shenisrab subashchutim, tenufa which is more chamur, that it applies even after shchita. Eino did how much more so shenisrab subachovrin, that each member of the partnership should have to implement his own ma'aseh tenufa. And the Gemara says, mishum delo efshar, meaning, you're right, theoretically, conceptually, tenufa, like smicha, should require more than one person in the case of partnership to implement tenufa, but it's just impossible. Not that it's impossible physically, but it's impossible halachically, because if every single partner does tenufa, like for example, you'll start with Reuven, and he's going to lift up the animal and wave it. Now, Shimon, and it's not just Shimon, there's Levi, Yehudi, Yisach, there are many people, members of the partnership, they're all clamoring to do the tenufa. So inevitably, some of the members of the partnership will not be able to get direct contact with the animal. They're going to be touching the hands of the one who came before them. And therefore, if you're setting it up in such a way that all the members of the partnership will be doing one ma'aseh tenufa simultaneously, then lenif v'leheder v'lenif. I'm sorry, I skipped 3 words. Kahavya chatzisa. In such a case, the hands of Reuven will be a chatzitza between the hands of Shimon and the parts of the animal or the live animal in terms of the tenufa. So therefore, you might say, well, why don't we do it the way we did it in smicha? In smicha, we lined up one after the other to do smicha and put the 2 hands on the carbon. Why not do the same thing in tenufa? Let's line up all the partners, one after the other will do tenufa. So the animal will be subject to multiple tenufos, but there's no chatzitza. And the answer is tenufa marachmana v'lo tenufos. The Torah says one tenufa and not more than one. Now, Rashi raises a very important question over here. Rashi says, I don't understand the Gemara. The Gemara is saying that there's a chatzitza problem if more than one partner would do the tenufa. So Rashi says, I don't get it. Tenufa means, as we learned back on Samachay, wherever it was, that the Kohen puts his hands underneath the hands of the Bailim, and together the Kohen with the Bailim, they do tenufa. And yet we don't apply the principle of chatzitza. We're not going to say, well, the hands of the Kohen are not directly in contact with the zevach. So you see that there's no din of chatzitza, and there's no requirement of maga, of direct contact between the hands and the korban. That we prove from Kohen. So Rashi postulates a distinction between the case of the Kohen and the case of the Bailim. In the case of the Bailim, we already derived from Smicha that every single one of the Bailim is in charge of Tnufa. So if the Chiyuv of Tnufa is incumbent upon each one of the partners, each one of the Balei HaKorban, then we have a serious problem in Chatzitza if so-and-so, who's also a partner, doesn't have direct contact. But in the case of the Kohen is not there to do and fulfill his obligation of Tnufa. He's only there as a secondary, shall we say, helper to aid in the Tnufa. But he's not really obligated in Tnufa. And therefore, despite the fact that his hands do not reach direct contact with the Zevach, it's kosher. Tosfos, by the way, is not happy with this Rashi. He thinks that even the Kohen is obligated in Tnufa. But he comes up with a very unique new idea. I'll just mention it in passing. And that is that there's no din of chatzitza with regard to Tnufa in terms of Avodas HaKohen. Meaning, every Avodas HaKohen requires direct contact, which is broken by chatzitza. So, for example, the shechita or the kabal sadam or the haktorah, every single dimension of avoda requires direct contact and chatzitza. But that's because it's done biyamin, with the yad yamin. An avoda that's done with the right hand requires direct contact, and a chatzitza passes, invalidates the avoda. But in the case of smicha, the Torah says, "V'somchu shtei yadav," both the right and the left hands. And in such a case, the obligation of the Kohen is to put his hands for the tenufa purposes underneath the hands of the Bailim, but he doesn't have to come in direct contact. So there's no chatzitza with regard to the Kohen. That's halacha in avoda, but in regard to Bnei Yisrael, meaning non-Kohanim, there, if we would postulate, based on the analogy and the comparison to smicha, that every single one of the partners needs to implement tenufa, it would require a direct contact with the animal. So therefore, we come to the conclusion that efshar, it's impossible, because the Torah says tenufa velo tenufos. We don't have, the partners lining up to do a tenufa one after the other, and therefore it's got to be one tenufa. And it's impossible to achieve one tenufa for many partners without the problem of chatzitza. Now the Gemara goes on to say, wait a minute, the Mishnah postulates that smicha only applies michayim, only when the zevach is alive, but once it's been slaughtered, it's after shechita, there's no smicha. So the Gemara asks, "Smicha b'shchutin lesa?" Is there no smicha on the cuts of the animal after the shechita? Now we're going to learn a sugya in a Mishnah in Tamid, Masechta Tamid. Now the Mishnah in Tamid speaks about all the kohanim that are necessary to bring up the kevesh of the Tamid, of the korban Tamid, piece by piece, aver by aver. So, for example, the first Kohen to go up the ramp in order to place the limbs of the Talmud onto the Eish on the Mizbeach, that Kohen will bring up the head of the animal together with one of its forelegs. And the second Kohen online will bring up the two hind legs, and so forth and so on. And all told, if I remember correctly, it's 13 Kohanim. You'll have to double check me on that, make sure I didn't make any mistake. Okay, now there's another halacha that we have to introduce, and that is that the Kohen Gadol has the rights to do the avoda whenever he sees fit, whenever it pleases him. He has carte blanche, meaning that normally the avoda belongs to the Anshe Mishmar, right? The Kohanim were divided up into Mishmaros of Kohanim and their families, and each Mishmar would get 1 week of avoda in the Mikdash in the first half of the year, and then another week in the second half of the year. Good. So now you have this Kohen who is climbing up the Kevesh until he gets to the top of the Mizbeach, and he's placing that, let's say the rush and so forth and so on, onto the H. All of a sudden, the Kohen Gadol, steps out frontal stage, and he says, "Sorry, buddy, that's it. I'm going to do the avoda." Now, Haya'ola Kevish, now the Kohen Gadol is climbing up this very steep incline called the Kevish to get to the top of the Mizbeach, and he needs support, physical support. So, Hasgan biyamino, the Sgan, the second in command, would be Tomech, would hold him up on the right side. He gil lamachzis hakevesh. Now he's halfway up the ramp. Achaz Sgan biyamino. Now the second in command, the Heisbach, the deputy, now gets more actively involved in helping out the Kohen Gadol. He holds his right arm, and he literally carries the Kohen Gadol up to the top of the Mizbeh. Hoshit lo harishon harosh v'haregel. Now, the first one of this whole line of Kohanim, who is bringing up the rush and the regel. Now he's on his way up, wants to get to the top of the Mizbech and place the rush and the regel on the Eish. And the Kohen Gadol says, no, step aside, I'm taking over. And at that point, the Rishon, the first of this whole string of Kohanim, which again I think is 13 in number, but for some reason I'm not finding it here, he now passes over the rush and the regel to the Kohen Gadol. What happens now? What is the Kohen Gadol's first activity when he receives the head and the foreleg? Somech aleh. He does smicha. Imagine, it's after shechita. V'zarkon, and then he tosses these limbs onto the fire. Hoshid hasheni l'rishon. Now we're up to the sheni. He's got the two forelegs. And the Kohen Gadol says, step aside. So he hands over the second Kohen on the list, l'rishon. First he gives it up to the Rishon, who is in front of him. And what does he have, the Sheni? He's got shtei yadayim. Interesting, the word yadayim, which we translate as arms or hands, in regard to animals, yadayim means the four legs, right? The animal doesn't have arms, but he has legs. No still the Kohen Gadol, and once again the Kohen Gadol receives from the second one the two forelegs. Somech aleim v'zorkan. He does smicha, then he tosses them onto the eish. Nishmat hasheni v'holcho, and now the second one goes home. V'kachai moshitim lo shar kol evarim, and this would happen one after the other. He tells you the 11 other Kohanim, so all told it's 13. I was right. So each hands over one portion of the Talmud. And again, every time the Kohen Gadol receives that portion from that Kohen on the list, Somech Aleim V'Zorka. Bisman Shu Rotzeh, Hu Somech Acherim Zorka. If he doesn't have the energy, he's a little bit too weak, the Kohen Gadol, to carry up all this meat, and throw it onto the Eish of the Mizbeach, then what he could do is he could have someone else do that. He'll do the smicha, and that's enough. So now we see that smicha applies even liachar shchita. That's against our Mishnah. Amar Abaye, Hasa mishum kvodo de Kohen Gadol. The smicha itself, says Havai, is not a real, genuine smicha. There is no smicha liachar misa. But to indicate that the Kohen Gadol is doing the avoda, we set up this kind of artificial act of smicha. But it's not the real smicha. Hadron alecha shtei midos. I think what that means is that if you didn't succeed with one midah, then for sure you're not going to succeed with two midos. So hadron alecha, you're going to have to come back and learn this parak again. And the word midah means a personality trait. So, it's very hard to work on one's personality traits and improve them. We're so stuck in our ways. Can you imagine trying to change two midos? So you're going to have to come back a second time around. Anyway, so now we start the 11th parak, Be'ez Hashem, which is called Shtei Alechem. And the Mishnah is going to compare and contrast the process by which we prepare and bake the Shtei Alechem with a similar process, but it's different, in preparing the Lechem HaPonim. As you know, the Lechem HaPonim brought on the Shulchan with two columns of 6 breads on each side, all told 12 breads, whereas Shtei Alechem is only 2 breads. So now we start with Lisha, right? The first what word can I use? The first stage, we'll call it, of the process of preparing the Shtei Alechem is called Lisha. And Niloshos Achas Achas. There are 2 lechamim. Each one is kneaded with a K on its own. You might think that he could do the kneading of one large dough and then split it into half. No. It's got to be one dough for one of the lechamim and another for the second. And that's called Niloshos Achas Achas. However, what about the afiyah? So let me skip a few words in the Mishnah for a second, and we'll jump ahead to Lechem HaPonim, the Loshas Achas Achas. So the Lechem HaPonim, which is made up of 12 breads, like the Shtei Alechem made up of 2 breads, requires a separate lisha, preparing the dough for each and every one of the lechem. However, now we're up to the baking stage. The dough is prepared. So we go back to the 3 words that we skipped regarding Shtei Alechem, nefos achas achas. Just like the lisha was done each of the 2 lechamim on its own, so too the afiyah is done. So we put one dough into the oven. When that dough is baked, we take it out and we replace it with a second dough. And then we take it. So we have 2 maisa afiyah. Each one of the Shtei Alechem separate. However, in the case of Lechem HaPonim, by contrast, nefos shtayim shtayim. The Torah, in its divine wisdom, which is, again, defies our logical understanding, requires that you bake the lechem aponim in pairs of two. So you'll put two doughs into the oven and bake them. Take them out, and again put two doughs into the oven. You do this 6 times over until you have 12 lechamim that were baked 2 at a time. In contrast with the shtei lechem, where the shtei lechem means that each one of the 2 lechamim bakes on its own, is baked on its own. Okay, now we move on to another dimension of preparing the lechem aponim, and that's called tfus, which is loosely translated to English as a mold. You've seen how, the ladies, when they bake, very often they have a mold. They put the dough into a mold, a cookie mold, or this mold, or that mold. So now we're learning about the lechem aponim mold. And not only is there one mold, but there's going to be a second mold, 2 molds, each one at a different stage. And that's according to our Mishnah. The Brisa is going to add a third mold, a third tfus. So first of all, when he makes the dough, there's a tfus, there's a mold for that dough. So that helps. We should really keep in mind, in case you don't know this, that the lechem aponim were gigantic. You've ever been to a wedding where they have these gigantic challahs, they go from one side of the room to the other, lechem aponim was very, very large, very heavy also. So at first stage, they put it into a tfus. That's the tfus rishon, the first of the 3 molds. Now, the reason why we need a mold, as Rashi points out, is because the shape of the lechem aponim was very different, very complicated. And there's going to be a major machlokas, which is the subject of today's daf. What was the shape of the lechem haponim? Now Kshu Rodam. Okay, fine. He shaped the lechem haponim in this tfus rishon of the first mold, placed it into the oven. Now he takes it out of the oven. Nosnon l'tfus. He puts it into a second mold. Now, what's the purpose of the mold once you already have shaped the bread and it came out of the oven? It's already baked. And the answer is, says the Mishnah, Kadesh lo yiskalkel. It's very easy if the lechem is just left out as it is after you took it out of the oven, then it might get broken, it might get molded, it might, chip off a piece. And the lechem aponim has to be shlema, it has to be complete. So therefore we put it into a second defus. The Gemara asks the following: Minani mili, how do you know that both in the case of shtei lechem and in the case of lechem aponim, the original first stage preparation, meaning making the dough, has to be 1 lechem at a time? And the answer is, we're going to read the parsha of the lechem aponim. He tells you it's in Vayikra Perek Chaf Daled. Not this week's parsha, but the next week. And if you take a look at the pasuk, it says chala ha'achas. There's 1 chala. Melamed sheni loshos achas achas. 1 at a time. So that's as far as the lechem aponim is concerned. And each one of the lechem of the 12 lachmei ponim have to be prepared on their own, kneading the dough, before you place it in to the oven. Minayin shaf shtei lechem, okay? After all, the Mishnah says that there's one common denominator between the shtei lechem in its preparation. and the lechem aponim, and that is that the lisha has to be done one at a time. Talmud Lomer yir, there's an extra word yir, and that's coming as a ribui to tell us that just like in lechem aponim, each lechem is nilosha, is needed on its own, so too in shtei lechem, each one of the two lechamim are needed on their own. Minayin shafi yosef shtaim shtaim. Getting back to lechem aponim, where did you find a source in the Torah to the effect that you put two lechamim into the oven, actually two doughs to be more precise, simultaneously? Talmud Lama, this we derive from the pasuk V'samta osam. Now watch what goes on here. We have two words in this pasuk. Osam is in the plural, but V'samta seems to indicate the singular. But the answer is there's only one sima, meaning one putting into the oven, but osam of two doughs. So we, in one fell swoop, we put in two doughs. Well, now the question is, shall we, by analogy, require likewise, in the case of shtei lechem, that the shtayim, the two breads, should be baked simultaneously in the oven, both at the same time? Yochel af shtei lechem ke. Talmud Lomar, osam. There's a miud here that says osam, only those lechem aponim, osam in the plural, should be put into the oven two at a time. 1 second. We just derived from the pasuk v'samta osam that you have to put in two of the lechem aponim doughs at the same time. How can you now tell me that the word osam, that very same word, is used to exclude shtei lechem? And the Gemara answers, "Hi osam ha." Right. So the Gemara asks the question, "Hi osam ha fikte." Right. You already used it to teach us that in the shtei lechem, the lechem aponim, you need to put two doughs simultaneously into the oven and bake them. And the answer is imkain. If the Torah only wanted to teach us that you put in and bake two loaves of the lechem aponim simultaneously, Lemakra could have said v'samtem. Why v'samtem? Because you already have the sima. Sima means the act of putting it into the oven. And it's written tam, which is like osam in the plural, to teach you that that act should be done with two lechavim at the same time. Why does it say v'samta osam? An extra word, right? If you wanted to say v'samtem, right? V'samtam would have been enough. But now it says v'samtam osam. So if we only had v'samtam, we would certainly derive the conclusion that you have to put in two loaves simultaneously. But how do we exclude shtei lechem? And the answer is osam is shamet b'nei tarta. So from the word osam, we're going to derive two halachic conclusions. One is with regard to lechem aponim, which is the context of this pasuk, that you need to put in two lechamim into the oven simultaneously, bake them both, and a miut from the word osam to tell you that in the case of shtei lechem, you're going to bake each one of the two lechamim separately. There's no din that you have to bake them two at a time, two simultaneous. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa. Now we're going back to the subject of the mold, of the tfus. And we're going to quote a Brisa, and according to this Brisa, we're going to see that the Mishnah had only mentioned two tfusim, and the Brisa mentions three. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa, v'samta osam bitfus. How does he see it in the words v'samta osam? This I don't know. He says that the word v'samta osam implies an act of precision and skill. And these intricate loaves are are going to be placed into their molds, meaning tfusim. Now the Brisa says shlosha tfusim hein. Why do we need three molds? Let's go over it. Nosum litfus vadainu batek. The first of the three molds is used when the dough is still a dough. And you want to mold the dough, so you have a mold to mold the dough. Now we get to a second tfus. We're up to the second stage. We don't just have a dough, but now we're baking the bread in the oven. And kamin tfus hayel of a tanur. When he places the dough from the first tfus into the oven, he doesn't just place it into the oven. He first puts it into a second mold. Now, the reason why he needs a second mold that was inside the oven is this would somehow enhance, or what word could use, this was advantageous to the baking of the bread, because they would put this mold inside the oven, turn on the oven, the mold itself got burning hot, and then they would pour the dough from the first tfus into the second tfus. And the Brisa says, Ukshuroda, Redias Hapas, meaning taking the dough that after it was baked, and you have baked bread in the oven, now you have to take it out. Like if you ever seen there's not far from where you are, there's Agvania, where they have like Italian kind of pizza, so at least last time I was there, they show you how they take it out, take the pizza out. Shurat nosna litfus. Now this is very interesting. He already has a baked bread, and yet he wants to put it into a mold, because the mold will protect the bread and its tsura, its shape, kadesh lo tiskalkel, so it doesn't get ruined, doesn't get broken, and so forth and so on. Now the Gemara asks the following question. By the way, the Rambam Shita is that all these three defusim are made of zav, are made of gold. Rashi holds that the first and the third are made of gold, but not the middle one. The middle one is made of metal. In any event, lahadja l'tfus kama, you already had the first mold, and now you took it out of the oven, putting it into a second mold. I'm sorry. Took it out of the oven as a third mold. The second mold was in the oven itself. So you poured from the first to the second. Now when you take it out and it's already baked, why not put it in the first mold? Why do you need a third mold? And that's called in the Gemara's language, lahadja l'tfus kama. And the Gemara answers that the tfus inside the oven is not going to be the right place for the lechem. Why? Keva the afile nafcha. Because in the process of baking, the dough expands. Sometimes it goes over the sides, or sometimes even on the bottom it expands. And therefore you need a different tfus to protect the bread, the loaf, after it came out of the oven. Now, the only thing that bothers me, I just want to see if anybody asks this question. Tosus thinks that it only expands upwards, and therefore the original mold should still be fit. Okay. So now we're up to Itmar, and we're going to speak about a major machlokes about the shape of the lechem upon it.